In February 2025, Canadian travel to the United States dropped by 40% compared to the same month in 2024. Not a gradual decline, not a seasonal fluctuation, a 40% collapse in a single month. And according to a March poll by Abacus Data, 62% of Canadians now plan to avoid traveling to the United States for at least the next year. That's not just a tourism statistic, that's a $4 billion annual loss to the American economy. Hotels empty, restaurants closed, border towns watching their primary source of revenue disappear because Canadians have decided they'd rather vacation anywhere else. This is what happens when you treat your largest trading partner like an adversary. This is the direct result of Donald Trump imposing 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, threatening to annex Canada as the 51st state, and spending months publicly humiliating Canadian leaders. And now, according to sources familiar with planning discussions in Ottawa, the Canadian government isn't just responding with retaliatory tariffs. They're preparing detailed contingency plans to exit the United States Mexico Canada agreement entirely. The same Mark Carney who just secured Canada's entry into Europe's $244 billion safe defense program, the same prime minister who quietly outmaneuvered Trump by diversifying Canada's strategic partnerships, is now building economic relationships specifically designed to reduce Canadian dependence on the United States market. And he's not being subtle about it. Under Carney's leadership, Canada has been working to eliminate internal trade barriers and accelerate new trade partnerships abroad. The message is clear. If America wants a trade war, Canada has options. The Canada US Mexico Agreement, known as CUSMA in Canada and USMCA in the United States, is up for mandatory review on July 1st, 2026. That's less than 6 months away. Under the terms of the agreement, all three countries must declare whether they want to renegotiate, renew, or withdraw. And while the agreement isn't technically set to expire until 2036, the review process gives any country the opportunity to fundamentally change or exit the deal. Trump negotiated this agreement during his first term. He touted it as one of his greatest accomplishments, and now he's on track to destroy it through his own actions. To understand how badly Trump has miscalculated, you need to see what's happening on the ground in American border communities. The mayor of Haines, Alaska, a town that's literally only connected to the outside world through Canada's Yukon Territory, has publicly warned that Trump's tariffs are destroying the normally friendly relationship between Americans and Canadians. These aren't abstract economic theories. These are real towns watching their economies collapse because Canadians who used to cross the border to shop, eat, and vacation have stopped coming. And it gets worse. Starting April 11th, 2025, the Trump administration implemented a new requirement that any Canadian entering the United States for more than 30 days must register with authorities and be fingerprinted. Think about what that signals. You're treating citizens of your closest ally, your largest trading partner, your next door neighbor like potential criminals who need to be tracked and cataloged. Canadian business travelers who used to cross the border multiple times per month for meetings are now looking for alternatives. Canadian families who used to spend weekends in American cities are choosing European vacations instead. The economic damage is already measurable and it's accelerating. American tourism groups have issued warnings that they're losing Canadian traffic permanently, not temporarily, permanently. Because once Canadians establish new vacation patterns, once they discover they prefer European destinations or domestic travel, they don't come back. According to industry analysts, the shift in Canadian travel behavior could represent an annual loss of up to $4 billion for the US economy. That's larger than the entire GDP of some small states. But here's what makes this truly strategic. While Trump was busy alienating Canada with tariffs and annexation threats, Mark Carney was in Brussels finalizing Canada's entry into the European Union's Safe Defense Program. While Trump was demanding that Canadians be fingerprinted to enter the United States, Carney was building trade relationships with European partners who actually value Canada as an equal. And while Trump was publicly suggesting Canada should become America's 51st state, Carney was quietly demonstrating that Canada has options that don't involve dependence on an unreliable neighbor. According to officials familiar with Canada's economic strategy, the diversification away from US markets isn't a threat. It's already happening. And the CUSMA review in July is when Trump will finally understand the cost of treating allies like enemies. Now, let's talk about what Canada is actually building as an alternative to US dependence, because this isn't just about defensive measures or temporary retaliation. This is a comprehensive restructuring of Canada's entire economic and strategic orientation. And it's happening faster than anyone in Washington seems to realize. Start with the European connection. Canada's entry into the Safe Defense Program wasn't just about military contracts, it was about establishing Canada as a trusted strategic partner of the European Union at exactly the moment when Europe is questioning America's reliability. According to diplomatic sources familiar with ongoing negotiations, Canada and the EU have been accelerating discussions about expanded trade cooperation that goes well beyond defense, energy partnerships, critical minerals agreements, technology sector collaboration. These aren't vague intentions. These are active negotiations with draft frameworks already circulating. Then there's the Asia Pacific strategy. While Trump has been threatening tariffs on everyone, Canada has been quietly strengthening relationships with Japan, South Korea, and other Pacific partners. The goal, according to Canadian trade officials speaking on background, is to create multiple reliable markets so that no single country, including the United States, can use economic coercion as a weapon against Canada. Diversification isn't just smart policy, it's survival. And here's the part that should terrify American businesses. Canada isn't just looking for new customers, they're looking for new suppliers. For decades, Canadian companies bought American products because of proximity, established relationships, and the tariff-free environment created by NAFTA and then USMCA. But when the United States proves it's willing to impose 25% tariffs despite a trade agreement, when American presidents threaten annexation, Canadian procurement officers start asking why they're taking that risk. European suppliers look a lot more stable. Asian manufacturers offer competitive pricing without the political uncertainty. According to a May 2025 analysis by Oxford Economics, Canada had effectively begun suspending retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products following certain exemptions. But Canada's Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne immediately called that assessment a falsehood, stating that 70% of retaliatory tariffs remained in place. That's not the behavior of a country looking to de-escalate. That's the behavior of a country that's decided it can afford to fight back because it's no longer entirely dependent on the American market. And they're right, because while Trump was tweeting threats, Carney was building options. And those options become permanent on July 1st if Trump doesn't change course. But the most devastating evidence that Trump has lost control of the situation came in early December 2025, when the U.S. Trade Representative held mandatory hearings in Washington about whether to renew CUSMA. These weren't small stakeholder meetings. These were 3 full days of testimony from nearly 150 American business leaders, industry groups, and trade experts. And almost every single one of them begged the Trump administration not to destroy the trade agreement. Riley Bushew, vice president of the Northwest Horticultural Council, representing America's biggest apple, pear, and cherry growers, a $13 billion industry, told the hearing that retaliatory tariffs from Mexico during Trump's first-term trade war had already damaged his sector's exports. Then he issued a stark warning. With thousands of American family tree fruit farms already at risk of going out of business, losing preferential access to Mexico and Canada would be devastating. His exact words, "There are no other export market opportunities capable of offsetting the severe economic losses if we lose preferential access to Mexico and Canada." Think about what that means. One of America's major agricultural sectors is telling the government that Trump's trade war is an existential threat, not a negotiating inconvenience, an existential threat. And they're not alone. Dave Walton, secretary of the American Soybean Association, warned that Trump's tariffs on steel, aluminum, and auto parts increase the likelihood that U.S. soybean farmers will end up in the crosshairs of retaliatory measures. The American Automotive Policy Council, representing GM, Ford, and Stellantis, argued that vehicles and parts meeting the tariff-free requirements under CUSMA should be exempt from Trump's new tariffs because that was the deal Trump himself negotiated. And here's the kicker. At the same hearings, Trump was asked directly about the future of CUSMA. His response, he said the United States would either let the agreement expire or work out a different deal with Canada and Mexico. Let it expire. The trade agreement he spent his first term negotiating, the deal he called one of his greatest accomplishments, he's now casually suggesting might just expire. According to sources familiar with the administration's internal discussions, there's significant concern among Trump's own economic advisors that he doesn't fully understand the consequences of CUSMA collapsing. The 3 countries did over $1.6 trillion in trade in 2024 under this agreement. Roughly 50% of that trade involves supply chains where components cross borders multiple times during production. A car part might cross the border 3 or 4 times before being assembled into a final vehicle. Every time it crosses under Trump's new tariff regime, it gets hit with another 25% tax. The math is simple and brutal. If CUSMA expires or if Trump's tariffs remain in place, American manufacturers can't compete. Canadian and Mexican companies will find other partners, and the United States loses access to $1.6 trillion in trade that American jobs depend on, all because Trump decided treating allies like enemies was good politics. So, what happens on July 1st, 2026? The honest answer is that it depends entirely on whether Trump understands what he's about to lose. And right now, there's little evidence he does. If Trump continues his current path, threatening tariffs, suggesting annexation, treating Canada like a hostile nation instead of America's closest ally, then Mark Carney walks into that COSMA review meeting with options Trump doesn't have. Canada has already secured entry into Europe's $244 billion safe defense program. They're accelerating trade partnerships across Asia Pacific. They've demonstrated they can withstand American economic pressure because they're no longer entirely dependent on the U.S. market. Carney can credibly threaten to walk away from COSMA because he spent the last year building alternatives. What does Trump have? A coalition of American business leaders begging him to stop, agricultural sectors warning of existential threats, auto manufacturers calculating that his tariffs will add $12,000 to the price of every vehicle, border towns watching their economies collapse as Canadian tourism disappears, and a trade agreement that he himself negotiated that he called a historic victory that's now on life support because of his own actions. The political consequences for the United States go beyond economics. When your closest ally decides you're too unreliable to depend on, when they start building partnerships specifically designed to reduce their vulnerability to American decisions, that's not just a trade policy failure. That's a fundamental realignment of global relationships. And once that realignment happens, it doesn't reverse just because an election changes administrations. Canada's diversification strategy will outlast Trump. The European partnerships Carney is building will continue regardless of who's in the White House. The Asian trade relationships will deepen over time. And the lesson other countries are learning that the United States under Trump cannot be trusted to honor its own agreements or treat allies with basic respect. That lesson becomes permanent. July 1st, 2026 is less than 6 months away. Trump has that long to decide whether he wants to save the trade deal he spent his first term creating, or whether he'd rather watch Canada walk away, taking $1.6 trillion in annual trade and decades of partnership with them. Based on everything he's done so far, he's choosing the latter, and American workers and businesses will pay the price for generations.